Reset the world.
And welcome everyone to Brain Swap, where today we are talking about otaku stereotypes. Oh yes, we're gonna go there. We're gonna talk about what people think otaku are like, and what might be good about that, possibly.
Stereotypes: the good, the bad,
the smelly.
the smelly.
So let's start with that one, because that's certainly something that people bring up a lot as a stereotype of anime otaku. And we should mention we're talking specifically about anime and manga otaku, as opposed to sort of the broader sense of otaku as fan. So we'll kind of focus on that. So yes,
there's the Japanese term otaku and concept, and the U.S. version of otaku.
And we'll be addressing both. We're kind of focusing on the American version of that because that's kind of what we are.
Yes.
So let's talk about the smell.
The smell. The funk.
Yeah. And we're not talking about the music.
We got the funk.
Mm-hmm.
Well, everybody knows that if you don't shower, you begin to develop the funk. And the longer you go, the more funkier you get.
And in fairness, we've had this in other fandoms as well.
Yeah. It's not restricted just to otaku.
Yeah. Gaming cons have had this for quite a while. So, we shouldn't feel too bad about it. But it is certainly a thing.
It's a thing that, when it's observed or smelled, is not just duly noted, but noted and, oh my gosh.
Well, yeah. Well, and we also have the issue that Kaiser, we also have that stereotype of otaku being smelly, not just at cons, but also at like otaku gatherings, club meetings. We get that as well. That at club meetings that happens too.
Yes, and some of it, seems to be just I was busy or I didn't get a chance this weekend, but some of it seems chronic. You can let a person slide once in a while, but if they're a regular basis, then you begin to wonder if that's something that was overlooked in some of the developmental training.
And it's a tough one too, because it's something that we're not trained in how to deal with.
Yeah.
Right. You don't just go to somebody and say, "You smell."
Although I've had friends who are so crazy they'll do stuff like that. Which, if you don't realize that you smell, like, some people can get away with not showering one day and not stink. But if they've been sitting on a couch that somebody else has left a lot of stink on, suddenly their clothes pick up that stink, and next thing you know, you're carrying that stink with you. And if you don't smell it or somebody else does, it's nice to have them smell for you.
And there's a cultural difference here too. There are some cultures that are more forgiving of personal odor, which doesn't make it right or proper. Different cultures are different, but that, you're in another culture now. But that is sometimes where it comes from, is that folks are just from a culture or even just a family where that's just not a big deal.
But having sensitive nostrils, it's sometimes scary to sit in a chair after somebody has left long before you got there and have left odoriferous remainders, shall we say?
Yep.
And you say, well, what happened to this chair? Why does it smell so bad?
So that's certainly one of them out there. I think it is something that does need to be addressed if it comes up. So I think if you're with somebody who has been, who is, let's say, odoriferous, let's be clear, it is appropriate to take the person to the side. Don't shout it in front of everybody.
Yeah, you don't want to embarrass them. You want to change the behavior.
Exactly. Yeah. You just say, by the way,
I did notice a little bit of smell going. You might want to shower or change your clothes, or both. Or wash the clothes that you get back into.
Yeah. And you don't even have to give them suggestions. Just say, hey, I just noticed, there's a bit of a funk issue going on here. I just want to let you know. And they can intuit from there.
Yeah,
they'll probably know.
Pick it up and run with it once they realize.
Yeah, they can figure it out. They're probably not that.
But there's a bunch of folks who get hung up in the events that are going on, say, for example, at a con or just playing a lot of games or watching a lot of shows, and in as a friend, and they may not realize they're starting to go down that path where they've really got to kind of deal with it. Because they get used to it. They go kind of nose blind to your own smell, and it's good to have friends who are kind enough to help you out.
That is
before you embarrass yourself.
Well put. But that's certainly not the only trait out there. It's certainly like a stereotype.
I'm sorry, D. That is funny. Don't take this the wrong way, but did you bring a bag of rotten squirrels with you to the con?
Not the best way of putting it in real life. But yes, that thought definitely goes through one's head more than once. I've been at cons where it just kind of overpowers you.
And sometimes, I mean, I've been at cons where I have been not on the ball, so I didn't get a hotel room.
Yeah.
And I've ended up staying up all night or sleeping on a floor or in my van. And I know I'm not the freshest daisy once I come back out, and I can tell that some people have been doing that for a few days.
And this is an important thing, is, be aware this is a matter of, you're at a con with other people, interacting with other people. That is part of how you're interacting, right? That just as much as if you had a, if you were carrying a giant pole and whacking people with it, the smell can be the same thing. That is part of your.
Oh, that's a good analogy, because it's the kind of thing that wields a larger circle around you than you realize.
Just be aware.
That's one stereotype of otaku, but it spills over, as we said, to several different groups, and I've seen people in the electronics world who go that direction, people in the music industry, but otaku kind of get labeled with that.
Yeah, definitely.
I think sometimes more so than others. There's famous actors who do that too, and have a reputation, but it could be a stage, it could be a period of life, or just scenario, but still, yeah.
Well, and that's not the only thing. I mean, certainly there's the stereotype of the sort of antisocial otaku.
Yeah.
And this comes across in a couple different ways, obviously. So, and starting at the basics, there is the shy otaku who just doesn't really know how to interact with people.
Oh, I have seen that. with otaku. But usually when pressed, they do pull out their social skills.
Yeah.
But they keep there's some otaku who keep such a shy reserve.
And it can be very off-putting. It can come across as not quite aggressive, but as just kind of shut down, like they just don't want to talk to anybody.
And it's not because they're not necessarily stuck up or anything.
Right.
They just don't have anything to say, or don't know that they would contribute necessarily to the conversation. But it is a stereotype, and sometimes we follow through with that stereotype.
Sure, I was certainly like that in my early at cons, because I went to a couple of cons where I wasn't with anyone else, and so I was alone.
It's a very different experience when you're going to a con by yourself than going with friends.
Yeah,
and it can make a completely different experience.
Definitely, and when you're alone, and especially if you have things to do, and you kind of want to take care of things, you can come across as much more shut down and much kind of less interested in other people than when you're with 2 or 3 other people, and you're all chatting back and forth, and they're starting things and you're starting things. So certainly it comes from somewhere. But I think also there is a more general sort of trait with that too. It's not just at a con where there's a million things going on. Also in just general social gatherings,
in regular life. Yeah. Everybody's talking about the sports game or something that I really didn't follow, and so I don't really have much to say. I mean, I'm not trying to be antisocial. I just have nothing to say.
It's like the IT crowd, boy, that cricketer really is. Oh yeah, my goodness.
If you all get a chance to see the IT crowd, it's a great series. It's a riot.
British sitcom.
British sitcom, and the first couple seasons are just a riot.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there is that sort of reservedness, might be a better term for it. that tendency to just kind of not put ourselves out there.
So that does lend to the stereotype that otaku are kind of antisocial.
Yeah. And let's be honest, what do we are defined by our consumption of media, right? We're spending all of our time watching anime and reading manga, which is generally going to be a more solo pursuit.
That does make sense. If you get into a scenario where you're watching anime and not a lot of people around you are, it is going to be a solo pursuit for a lot of people. And it's fantastic when you can get a local club and watch it together and hear the responses that other people have. I mean, I never would have thought to laugh at that part, but now that I realize that is a riot.
And actually, that's a really big deal especially for a lot of more otaku oriented anime. There are a lot of cases where you're watching something and somebody starts laughing and you realize, oh, that's a joke. I get it now.
They're referring to that other thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So it'd be very, very useful to do that. But I certainly, in general, I think this is a more introspective kind of a hobby than most other things, and that can lead to that stereotype. And of course, as with any stereotype, all it needs is a little bit of proof, and folks turn that into absolute proof for everybody. So you got to be careful about that. A few comments in the chat room I wanted to jump into here. Fisher brings up positive stereotypes like the ability to spot detail in movies.
Oh yeah.
That the common folks will miss, and we'll get back to that. We definitely want to talk positive as well. Kaiser asks, which con has been my favorite? I just want to mention this before we forget. My favorite actually is there's a small con in the area called Star City Anime, and it's run by people I know. It's a really nice group. It's very small. It's very intimate, and I just really like that more than the big cons. Big cons are fun in their own way, but that kind of fits me better.
Yeah, there's a certain intimacy that you enjoy at a smaller con, and you get to know more people, and you feel like what you do and say is more, it's more heard, it's more relevant.
Yeah.
At a big con, you kind of sometimes feel like a number or a cattle.
Yeah, exactly.
And to some degree, I mean, they have to do it that way because there's so many people trying to enjoy so many things at the same time. But with a smaller con.
And also, you get to know the other folks at the other con goers, because you see them in the hall every couple hours.
I've seen you so many times. Okay, so what's your name? I know you like this, and I know you like that.
And we've talked about how you could get better access to the guests there too.
Oh yeah, fantastic access for guests.
Yeah. So what about you? What's your favorite con?
I'm not sure. I'd like to go to more, and so I could find out and choose. Pretty much. I haven't had any really bad con experiences that have made me cross any off my list necessarily. But there's certain aspects to each con. So I guess I'm not quite a connoisseur. The bigger cons have they're on a floor of, say, for example, a dealer's floor or an artist's floor, and it just feels like it goes for miles. And you see stuff there you never see anywhere else, and you never thought to look up online. I mean, had I known, I would have looked for it, but I didn't know until I ran into this guy, or something so obscure like the guy who was selling cells from anime.
Yeah, you're not going to get that at a lot of smaller cons.
The custom-made okra.
The ocarina. Okra is something very different.
Okra, yeah, custom-made okra. We fry it up here differently.
But yeah, and it's kind of like we were talking about cake versus pie the other day, is that you can have a great small con experience and you can have a really bad small con experience.
Yeah.
The larger con experience can tend to be more homogeneous.
And somebody in one of our podcasts months ago said that yes, it's great to attend with friends, but it can also be bad if you choose the wrong friends to go with, because some friends are easier to enjoy things with than others. So being able to go with friends is usually better.
And some friends like to enjoy themselves a little bit too much.
And then you end up paying babysitter, and that's not fun.
Yeah,
because then you're missing out on all the stuff you want to do.
Exactly. Yeah. So you got to be aware of who you're hanging out with. Yeah. But yeah, people. I'm going to really enjoy seeing what the recommended videos are for this video on YouTube. That's going to be fascinating. So yeah, so there is certainly that shyness, that kind of antisocial aspect to anime in general. I think also, I wonder if that isn't also kind of that general geek trait coming out as well.
I think so, because most geeks are kind of reserved in their outspokenness for the most part.
Yeah.
Now, friends of geeks, they'll go out and blah 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 blah. Hey, everybody!
Well, and it's also funny because it depends on the geekness.
Yeah.
If you go to a LARP, that's full of the most social people you
Outgoing.
want. They won't shut up. It's great, and they're very generally very welcoming. And
so you could have a lark at a LARP.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it depends, but generally the geek stereotype, I think that is one of those cases of a geek stereotype that does hold true. I don't think geeks are as antisocial as the strongest stereotype, but I think geeks are generally shyer than the average person.
What about the
quiet?
This person is geek, but they clean up well. The transformation to this is a wonderful person, just sort of in their shell.
Well, and that also gets to the fact that geeks, well, I think everyone have, we all have different sides to our personality. Yeah, you ever had this at work where you're talking to, the sysadmin, or you're talking to a sales guy, something, and you look down and you realize that's a Goku figurine on your thing, and you're like, wait a minute.
Okay, you're in the club here. Okay.
And you find out like they've watched every single episode multiple times.
It's amazing when that kind of thing happens.
And they can be the most social, outgoing person.
Like, I didn't know you were into this. Yeah, let me tell you. And you get on a roll suddenly. This is interesting. Master Chief Snake brings up the autism issue.
Yeah.
And of course, autism is a spectrum, and there's different levels and degrees. There's high functioning and different levels of like Asperger's and things like that. And so I think a lot of our culture these days lends towards that behavior.
Oh, interesting.
And we do find a number of folks who attend anime conventions who do have the traits that appear to be autistic. And I think what I've really enjoyed about the otaku fans, they're accepting of this for the most part. Some people will roll their eyes when you can tell that something needs to be question doesn't need to be answered, or something needs to go on. But as far as the diversity and differences, they're generally friendly and accepting of people's peculiarities.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's a bit of a soapbox for me. Something that I think science fiction and fantasy fandom has always been better at than most other fandoms is that inclusiveness, because we have always valued that idea of, for lack of a better word, human progress and human evolution, right? We're always reading these stories about people and societies who built better societies in the future. We're looking at fantasy stories about people who are learning those big epic lessons about life and such things. And so you go back and you look at science fiction for decades, and we've always been preaching tolerance and understanding of other people, going back to the day the earth stood still. My gosh.
Oh, that was a great one.
Fantastic. And what's wonderful is it's not a political tolerance, right? It's not the right versus left definitions of tolerance. It's that general sense that there are lots of different people in the world, and there are lots of different ways forward, and we need to explore as many of them as possible. So something like the autism spectrum is very important to research and to understand, to not stigmatize the people who are like this, but to understand where they're coming from, so that we can learn more about it and move forward in the future. So yeah, I think absolutely that is something that that we're pretty heavy on.
Oh, Desert Fox. Here we go. What about closet otaku?
Oh yes.
I'm a regular person in public, but in private I've got my otaku-dom.
And like we were saying before, I think I think most of us do that. I don't know of any otaku personally who wears it on their sleeve as much as they do at the anime club, right?
Yeah. I've seen some who are outgoing outside of it, and pretty pretty open about it. But for the most part, fans sometimes you can't tell until, like you said, until some subtle difference. Oh, wait a second, this guy's got a Full Metal Alchemist pocket watch. Okay, yeah, fess up. You're a fan.
I was behind in this. I always kind of regret I was never able to figure this out. I was sitting in traffic behind a Jeep, and on the back of the Jeep there was one little sticker, and it was this stylized rose. I looked at it and I was like, that looks like
the
Revolutionary Girl Utna.
Oh,
and I was, and it was one of those idle thoughts where I was like, it's obviously just some symbol that it just looks like that. And there was some writing around it, and I just started idly reading it. Shoujo, Kakume, Utna. And just as I read that, like it drove off. It accelerated off, and I was like, oh my gosh! Not just the anime, but just the Japanese words spelled out in English around it. That's a fan. And I'm, again, lost in traffic. But yeah, there are all those little
it's
hints.
funny. Most people would just sort of see it and not really think too much about it. But somebody who knows and recognizes can identify, and wow, it's instant kindred almost,
Definitely. No, yeah, I see that stuff and I'll absolutely start talking.
Oh, those were both great shows there. Welcome to the NHK and Watamote.
And those bring up another aspect of this whole subject, which is the question of, do we perpetuate those stereotypes? Do we kind of self-flagellate? Do we perpetuate those stereotypes ourselves through our behavior? And I would say, and perhaps going further, do we do anything to dispel those stereotypes, right? Like, are we doing anything to make people think that we're not like that at all? Or can they just make that assumption and continue on? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, I've found myself following some of the stereotypes, actually. Like some of the collection. I look at my anime collection and how it's grown over the years, and models and now cells and pictures and stuff, and to some degree I can see that collection. And I can somewhat see how if I just talked about anime, it would isolate me more. But I talk about other things with folks, so they know if they want to talk about anime, they can come and talk with me about that or anything else. But I have lent a little bit to some of those stereotypes, and I suppose some of them are not helpful. Like when I go to a con and I haven't got a room and I sleep in my van and I smell. Yeah, I can see that lending to it. Or when I'm low on energy and I just don't talk with people. I sit in a room.
I can't imagine that. I can't imagine you low energy
not
and
talking.
Talking to other people.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think that's absolutely a great point. That we do tend to just kind of go for our defaults, quite understandably. Have you seen, was it the documentary Trekkies? I think was the name of it.
Trekkies? No, I wanted to see that.
So it's, for those not familiar, it's a documentary where they follow, I think, 4 or 5 Star Trek fans sort of about their lives. And it's everywhere from the teenager who's just really into Star Trek, to a woman who is shorter than average, and thus gets kind of a lot of commentary and such and so forth. And she wears a Starfleet uniform every day, like to work.
Wow. To work.
And she works in the post office, I think.
That is cool.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. If I came to the post office and there was whoa. So you're gonna get this right, unlike the rest of the people.
Well, and what's cool is she says basically, she got into Star Trek, she got into things, and she says, this is my symbol that this is what I believe in. These principles of Starfleet are my values. And so by wearing that, I am telling you that I'm going to behave that way.
Wow.
Yeah.
So she's codified her behavior based on that. That's impressive.
It was really interesting. And the idea of wearing that on your sleeve as a social marker to other people. And on the other, to that point, I don't know about you guys, but anime has changed my life. There are works of anime that literally changed how I see certain things. I behave differently because of certain works of anime that opened my eyes.
Yeah.
So, why not tell other people in some visible way? Now, obviously, it's a little easier for Trek fans because folks know what a Starfleet uniform looks like. But that is kind of a challenge to us to say, kind of, embrace that aspect of your geekdom and let your freak flag fly.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
And it's, most otaku are not beating people over the head with their message. They're saying, hey, I found something I enjoy. Here it is. So yeah, and there's so many life lessons. The more a person hears different stories, the more they expand their knowledge, their mind, their experience, and they don't necessarily have to pay the penalty of time that's required to live through all these diverse and different experiences. And so you really get a larger palette of ideas and concepts that you can draw from when you need to come up with something. It's just fantastic.
I'm going to murder a speech from Doctor Who from a recent episode where he talks about how he's trying to stop a war. And one of the people says, you don't understand. And he says, oh, I understand. He said, you think this is a war. I've been through more wars than you can think of. I've been involved in wars far bigger than this little thing. I have done things that would horrify you, and I close my eyes and I can hear more screams than you will ever hear. And you know what you do when that happens to you? You hold it tight until it burns your hand, and then you say, no one will ever have to experience this again. And not on my watch. I will make sure that no one ever does what I had to do. And it's that kind of paying it forward of that anime and so many other things can do for us, of showing us, those lessons that we can then take in without having to, like you said, having to actually go through those experiences. And it's one of the reasons why we love these things. So getting back to the topic, otaku stereotypes. So we talked about the funk.
Well, what we haven't talked about, as we were mentioning the two shows that exhibit otaku, and I'd venture to say also, what was the one with the culture, the Society for Genshiken. I'd also throw that in there because we can see the club and the otaku within it, and their friends who kind of get wrapped up into it as well to some degree, the girlfriend and outsiders who don't think they're otaku until suddenly they are. And looking at that, the concept of neats and hikikomori.
So what is a neat?
So a neat neat stands for not in employment, education, or training.
So it's NEET.
NEET, and it's kind of funny. I think this is probably quite often more a Japanese thing, but probably see this in the US as well, where people are they're expected to either be employed or learning or training under somebody for a trade. And if you're not, you're kind of living off of mooching off of mom and dad or the society itself to get preservation. And so from that, sometimes the stereotype of being recluse or cheap or that can come into play. But for a lot of people, it's not because they necessarily want to be in that situation. It's some of the situational things have created an environment where it may be easy to stay there.
And then there's hikikomori, which I always have a difficult time pronouncing.
Me too.
Which is kind of similar, like you were saying.
And that's more of the reclusive. So you could have a NEET who's very social, but a hikikomori is more of a reclusive person. So if a person's needs are being met from their parents or their society, and they're comfortable with themselves not necessarily being in employment, education, or training, it creates a sort of a cocoon of self-indulgence that they can isolate themselves, because they're not going to have as much to relate to other people if they're not in education, if they're not in training, and they're not employed. They're not going to be socializing with those people, talking about those things, or moving in those circles. So their interests are going to become more isolated from those kind of discussions. And it becomes sort of a self-perpetuating cycle, because then to break out of that, you need more things that are cultural references. And if a person has kind of worked themselves into that circle, it can be hard to break out as habits form.
And getting back to that earlier topic about that sort of social awkwardness that a lot of geeks have, that only reinforces it. Because if you're a little shy or a little reclusive, then, well, why go out?
Yeah, I'm shy, so I won't go out, so I won't get socialization, so I become more shy.
And it's a more intense thing in Japan for a couple of reasons. Partly, I would say architectural, in the sense that because so many people live in Tokyo, there's such a huge number of people live in Tokyo or other very large cities, and there are convenience stores everywhere. It is very easy to just go down to the convenience store, a couple of times a week, buy everything you need. It's 2 blocks away, and that's all you need.
As a foreigner in Japan, I was there temporarily. I did that, and I felt like I want to get out and get to know people, but I'm such a recluse. Here I am. I'm just going down to the closest convenience store, getting the ramen noodles, going back to my place.
Well, and
I gotta get out.
And to be fair about that, I mean, Japan is such an alien world to us Americans, right? I mean, there so many things are different in Japan. It is psychically overwhelming there. So it's quite common for folks who go first to Japan to say, I need some things that are easy. I need to sometimes just go and get, that's top ramen. I know what top ramen is.
How to get this.
So yes, absolutely.
Well, yeah. There are certain things that lend to our culture moving in the direction of hikikomori and means. Internet culture.
Yeah.
It's very easy to get on and spend lots of time developing internet relationships, but not face to face, and you become more comfortable with communicating on the internet, and become less familiar and less comfortable than with the wide variety of behavior that you encounter in real life interactions.
Exactly.
And it can become then intimidating, because knowing what kind of response you should have is something that you develop through more and more exposure to those kind of interactions.
I was reading just the other day about a woman who asked a guy out when she was like not far out of college, and she said, I could literally feel the blood rushing to my head. I was incredibly nervous doing this. And she said, I almost blacked out asking the guy out. So she said she decided then she would go to a social event every day. She would call 3 guys afterwards every day.
Wow.
So she would get 3 phone numbers and call. And she said, so I had a date every day for like the next, I don't know, however many months. And she said, and almost none of them panned out. But heck, if she could,
just the experience of doing that.
Right. And she said by the end of that, she could ask out any guy, anywhere, anytime.
That is cool.
It's awesome.
I should do that. In fact, the beginning of this year, I was thinking, actually, no, it was at the beginning of last year. I was gonna ask out. I was going to make sure that I got turned down at least once a week.
Yeah, there we go.
I was gonna go for it. I'm just gonna, and if I didn't have enough failures under my belt, I would consider that a failure. I wasn't worried about having success. I was just worried about making the communication. I expected the failure.
It's like being a writer, right? You have to submit your work to a lot of different places, and you got to expect to not get accepted everywhere.
1,000 failures, it just takes one good entry.
Exactly. So yeah, and that gets back to this whole thing that I think, and it's one of the things that internet culture unfortunately rewards, is this idea that you never fail by loading another web page.
Yeah.
You can, and you don't even have to be involved in a community. You can just be loading, something awful or FARC or whatever. That's I'm showing my age. But anywhere.
What gets rewarded gets repeated, and that what gets repeated becomes a trait, and what becomes a trait eventually becomes a habit.
Yep.
What becomes a habit eventually develops into your character, and that's hard to change.
and that's just part of being on the internet. And even more than the internet, we live in an age And just recently have we gotten into an age where we have far more to consume than we can possibly consume. Lest we forget, up to maybe 150 years ago, most people had only ever read a half dozen books ever. Right. And we would only own maybe half a dozen books ever. And they'd read those books over and over again. The reason why so many things were based on Paradise Lost is because everyone had that. And that was the thing that they had read. Right. And that was the only thing they had access to. So suddenly now there's more anime, period, than you could ever watch, much less everything else.
The idea of anime being a core thing in otaku, I think it's a factor, but I've seen lots of cosplayers who know a little bit about anime, but they are way into cosplay. So into cosplay, it's incredible, and I still consider them otaku, but I haven't seen the same trends in Japanese culture, but I haven't had a chance to explore that.
There's some of it. Yeah, but I think that's it's getting into the definition of what is an otaku, and
and I mean the modelers who spend all the time modeling, so I think it's meaning the meaning of otaku in the US versus the meaning of otaku in Japan.
Sure. And then there's also, of course, sort of pop meaning of it in Japan versus pop meaning of it versus general meaning of it in Japan. So like, if you see a news story in Japan about otaku, increasingly it will generally refer to anime and manga fans more than it will refer to train otaku or whatever. So that is actually shifting a little bit more towards the American definition. But yeah, again, we could spend all day debating
the concept of otaku.
What otaku means.
If you're an otaku, you can call me an otaku, but if you're not an otaku, don't call me an otaku.
Yeah. So for now, we're focusing on anime and manga fans as kind of otaku. But yeah.
But some of the stereotypes, attention to detail in their subject matter, but not so much in other areas, but in their subject matter, finest details that you'd never notice.
And that's an interesting positive, I think, too. Actually, sort of. It can be positive, it can be negative. There are many geeks in general, and otaku in particular, who are, shall we say, sticklers for detail, for whom you can never contravene anything in established canon ever.
On frame 3, there was a button missing from my favorite character, and then it reappeared the next scene. What happened to that button? Did you guys have some special message in that?
Or the animation sucks. Oh, I can't believe it. So there's that, and even that can, I think, be usefully subdivided into the folks who are into kind of the detail for the detail itself, and those who are into it more for analysis. So the folks who are paying attention to the meaning behind the animation, and those who are looking at more for how much screen time are certain people getting. So people really pay attention to all these different aspects of otakudom. And again, that can be good, that can be bad. It really depends on what you use it for. And then we get back to the internet side of things, where you can be socially rewarded for noticing those details, for being, again, kind of detail oriented, or hyper-focused, or you can push people away by constantly complaining because the animation isn't up to your standards or what have you, right? So there's kind of a double-edged sword to that attention to detail. You can be, we were talking about the autism spectrum, and there's a stereotype among those on the spectrum of being hard to get along with because they focus on obsessively on certain things. And so you can be prickly in that way, or you can be helpful in terms of being the ultimate cataloger.
You could point out things and let other people draw their conclusions as to the value of it. Say, did you notice this? Yeah, and so much is different in our culture, the internet, dating, just socializing. It used to be lots of people in the US would go out to movies on the weekends, and you'd have huge movie halls. Movie halls shrank content increased, and then the advent of home theaters meant that people wouldn't go out and get in their socialization as much. Add in more of that as time goes on.
And there were a lot more public social events too.
Mm.
You'd have swimming meets, and you'd have picnics and roasts and all sorts of stuff. People were doing all the time, kind of out as groups. And as that died down, because people were spending more time at home because they could do more stuff at home, there wasn't as much reason to socialize in those ways.
And what's weird is people kind of begin to grow a fear of what they don't know about, and since they haven't been out and about, there's sort of an almost unrational fear sometimes. There are bad things out there. I don't want to say there aren't, but sometimes people grow an irrational fear of all the things that are out there because of the lack of exposure. And really, when the bad things happen, we all hear about them.
Yeah.
When we don't always hear about all the good things that happen. And so we're left to assume that there's a lot of bad stuff out there because we don't hear about the good stuff.
And I mean, let's address kind of the elephant in the room on that, which is Tsutomu Miyazaki over in Japan, who was the child murderer, otaku, back in the 90s, who I actually may have been around 2000. Anyway, let's just say a couple of girls disappeared, and he was discovered to have done it. And it was discovered that he hit every stereotype. He lived in his parents' basement. His room was full of otaku merchandise. He had just tons and tons of doujinshi of young girls in, shall we say, inappropriate situations. Very obsessive, didn't interact with anybody, very much a hikikomori, shut in. And so he kind of hit everything. And when that happened, there was a bad
backlash.
Backlash.
All the folks who are reasonable in their behavior suddenly got painted with the same brush. Oh, he's one of your associates because he engages in this stuff. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean we're going down the path he's going.
Right. But he absolutely reinforced those stereotypes to the public. And so from that point on, otaku are smelly basement dwelling pedophiles, basically, for a lot of Japanese people. It's taken a long time to recover from that, and it still hasn't recovered in Japan. So you certainly get that as well. And unfortunately, like you say, it only takes one negative to respond that way.
I'm curious, what is this here?
What do you mean?
BTTF. Kelowna 7H. So as I'm not sure I'm familiar with the
BTTF. I'm not sure. No, I don't know.
I'm curious.
Yeah. So yeah. And that gets to the complexity of, different cultural takes on things are often different enough that it's even hard for us to know exactly what it's like in other cultures. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's also certain, there are also positives, I think.
There are also positives.
Yeah.
And as some of our skills that are picked up in our fandom can relate to our jobs and the way we manage things, the way that we process and deal with things. And it's interesting to see how it plays out. Let's see, what stereotypes haven't we covered so far?
I mean, there's the it's interesting actually seeing stereotypes about money, because those have changed a lot over time. Back in the day, in the 80s and 90s, Back to the Future.
Back to the
right?
Future.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I do like Back to the Future.
So back in the 80s and 90s, the stereotype was that otaku spent all their money on anime. And then as the 2000s rolled around, the stereotype became that otaku spent all their time on anime, but didn't spend as much money on anime. That otaku were all high schoolers or college age students who were streaming it, downloading illegally. Even people in the industry got that stereotype about fans, that they were all just leeching off, again, true or not. So I think that's certainly changed that idea of how much you put your money where your mouth is. And we've certainly seen that in other fandoms as well. And there's been some backlash about comic book fans and how the true comic book fans were the ones who were spending all their money on all the figurines. Then there are the fans who go out and watch the Marvel movies and maybe buy one thing here and there, but not spending all this money on it. So how deep is their fandom compared to the person who is spending all their spare cash on it? And we certainly don't want to get into the whole what makes you a real fan debate, because that's silly. But there's also there's that stereotype around money, I think, which is certainly a question.
Now money being otaku being pecuniary, being a little bit tight, or
I think now the stereotype is more of them being more tight-fisted with their money than they used to be,
which is kind of strange, because as a stereotype that is as prevalent as that is, it's really not true, as we see in DVD sales, as we learned from Adam Sheehan, that we're actually driving some of the market with DVD sales. And that's impressive, because then we can say, hey, look, we're our fans. We're forced to be reckoned with.
And heck, look at adults.
Not just leeches.
Look at Adult Swim and Furry Curry. I mean, obviously, enough people are tuning into Adult Swim to drive them to finance more seasons of Furry Curry, which is still kind of mind blowing.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, I guess to be fair, I mean, let's be logical about this. The other side of that coin is that you don't have to spend money on Adult Swim other than your cable subscription. So it could be said that people are tuning in to watch it on TV. They aren't buying it. I don't know. But point being, that's actually, as you say, a perfect example of how there's this stereotype that otaku aren't buying, whereas in reality, a lot of them are.
Well, we also have a growing population of otaku as otakus get older, and they're still fans, and we have new fans who are joining, who are growing in their otakudom. So the age spread is getting wider and wider. So not only are we all we're not all young and broke like we used to be.
Exactly. That's exactly the case, is that we got that sort of narrowing down to kind of more or less high schoolers that we had back in the 2000s, and that's different now, right? It's kind of expanded out, which is nice. So yeah, that's definitely saved things. But I think there's also the stereotype to that point around sort of obsession, which you touched on briefly, which I think has also shifted around. Because I think back in, say, the 80s, the idea was that you were super obsessed with anime, but by necessity, at least in America, you had this kind of fragmentary knowledge. So you knew all this weird trivia about Ape Man, and this one thing about Robotech, or this one thing about the different thing, and you could name all the different series that Robotech was based off of, but you didn't know the wider picture necessarily. And then as the American industry collapsed and folks started focusing on individual shows, you'd be a fan of Naruto more than you were a fan of anime in general. So you'd know every character of Naruto backwards and forwards, and you'd know this show, maybe a couple of shows, just in huge depth, but you wouldn't know as much about anime as a whole. And now we're shifting back to where people have a wider understanding, and because there's so much more information now, you can have a better concept. I mean, we've seen this at cons, where people will do a panel and folks will ask, have you heard of this thing? And a lot of hands will raise for obscure stuff.
It's amazing to see people who've known stuff that is so obscure.
Definitely. And yes, Mech Warrior was a thing. It is still a thing. Mech Warrior is still a significant property, and certainly not as big as it was back in the day. Mech Warrior, also known as BattleTech, kind of complementary lines, giant robots in America. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's. But it is interesting how there has always been that stereotype of being obsessed, and very knowledgeable about these things.
And before otakudom in the U.S., we had comic book fans, kind of labeled in a similar thing, and sci-fi fans labeled in a similar thing. You know, and each of these subcultures had its own degree of geekdom, although it may not have been called geekdom per se. The guys who were into doing their cars were gearheads, you know. There was subspecialty focus in each subculture, and that kind of thing was appreciated in its own way, or not appreciated in its own way. And
you were a Trekkie or whatever.
Yeah, and so there the same term can be used as a compliment or derisively to insult someone, and you can kind of get some of the feel for that and how it's presented to you, and so it's not something new, but it's something that's developed a little bit as we've taken a lot of the Japanese culture things.
Yeah, geekdom in general and otakudom specifically has definitely evolved and has grown over time. So it's definitely different than it used to be, and it's more intense.
They used to portray comic book fans as the teenager with pimples, you know,
the comic book guy from The Simpsons.
Yeah, The Simpsons. So they're playing off of those stereotypes, and a lot of that kind of gets inherited to sci-fi and otaku. So some of those overlaps. Now, video games have developed their own following to such a degree that it's going to have its own thing. You know, we saw with South Park doing the spoof on the kids doing Warcraft to the point where they're not getting out of their seats to go to the bathroom. Mom, wipe hot pockets.
Right. But yes, so and that's to the point where you say geekdoms are different. You know, you compare that with, I just had it in my head, but there's certainly other geekdoms where you are expected to be intense, but in different ways. And otakudom has its pop culture perspective as opposed to other things, which we all have to be aware of. And like I think, like we said, there are positives and there are negatives about it. It's helpful to be aware they exist, and it's helpful to be aware that people are maybe judging you on that. And I think it's something that we don't talk too much when we talk about stereotypes. Is I think a lot of times people are aware of these stereotypes and their reaction is simply to kind of rail against society about them. And that's not really very, very effective. Right? It doesn't really help. I think what's more effective is to be aware of those. So in those social interactions, you can respond to them appropriately. So if you're in that situation and you have your FMA t-shirt on or your Attack on Titan t-shirt on, and you're walking around and somebody kind of sees that and arches an eyebrow, smile pleasantly.
Yeah.
Engage that person. Be nice. You don't have to say, hey, here's what's awesome about Attack on Titan. But understand that they are seeing you as this kind of social misfit, and you can react in the moment to deal with that.
And you can spin it in a way where it has a positive outcome.
Absolutely.
For everybody.
Yeah. Smile and move on and continue and prove to them that being an otaku isn't a negative, it's a positive.
Otaku pride.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yes. So we've been talking about this for almost an hour now. Thank you all very much for joining us and talking about this. Some great stuff in the chat room, as always.
Yeah.
So thank you for discussing this. It's one of those things that, as with many things, there's no right or wrong answer. Next week, we'll be talking about a topic, and one of our kind of yes or no questions that tends to stimulate a lot of discussion, which is this question of how much of your anime should you actually own, like as a physical copy or as a digital copy that's backed up and so forth. But we all recognize, most of us recognize, the importance and utility of supporting the industry, but we're not going to necessarily buy everything all the time.
I can't afford it. I wish I could.
Right.
If I had more money.
So what's the line? Right? What is the appropriate line for how much is appropriate to buy? How much is appropriate to just not buy? 90%, 10%, more or less? And does it vary by show? Does it vary by passion? If you really love something, should you be spending more money on it? So we'll be talking about that and kind of the morality of money next week on Brain Swap. Always an interesting topic.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe I might shuffle around the set a little bit.
We might be changing the set around a little bit. And this is actually good time to mention. We'll be changing around some of our shows as well. As you may have noticed that some of our shows have been kind of popping in and out. So we're going to be restructuring some of that as well over the coming weeks. So just be aware that's going to happen. But as always, we are committed to being here and talking with you guys. So
My other ride is a
other ride is a Valkyrie. Nice. Very nice. I will say that it's not the decal on the back of my truck says Sig Xeon. So yeah, there's a little bit of that there. All right. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. We will see you guys next week.
Thanks a lot for joining.
Bye-bye.
Join us next week.